First and foremost, welcome to Your Brain on Burnout. For those that don't know me, my name is Dr. Lisa Belanger. I am the CEO of Conscious Works. We're a consulting firm that works with companies from all over the world, teaching and implementing skills, habit, and work design for proactive mental health and performance. We really pride ourselves in being on the cutting edge of behavioral science, neuroscience, and the science of work to create meaningful change for the individual, team, and company. This is a part of a complimentary web series we're offering to engage discussion and leverage the science to be proactive about mental health and well-being. Today, you're hearing from our neuroscientist, Ty McKinney, also known as Ty the NeuroGuy, on the science behind burnout, a concept that's felt to some degree, but not often well understood. If you do have any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat. I will ask Ty them after. And without further ado, take it away, Ty.
Thank you very much, Lisa, for that kind introduction. So the topic today, as we just learned, is about burnout, which is something that I think we're all fairly acquainted with at this point. So I thought that I would start off by just sharing a little bit about some of my own burnout experiences over the last year, some of which are relatable, some of which I hope are not relatable. So to start off with, as Lisa mentioned, I'm wrapping up my PhD right now. And when the pandemic started, basically I had to transition all my lab work to being done remotely. So this is one source of stress that did contribute that I think a lot of us could probably relate with. Something that hopefully is a little bit more foreign that no one else has had to deal with is that my university actually got hacked over the last summer. So there was a ransomware attack that happened at the University of Utah, and lucky me, my lab was one of the few that was compromised by the data breach. And I thought that this was, somewhat unfair. Like, why me? Eventually, the university did end up paying over $500,000 worth of ransom in order to de-encrypt the data. Although my data actually never did fully get restored, so I had to go from our backups. So that was pretty stressful. That added a little bit of a burnout to my top of mind. And as I mentioned, being in Salt Lake City, after the killing of George Floyd, there was all the Black Lives Matter protest. And this is when it became apparent that a lot of the burnout that I was personally experiencing was experienced on a much more systemic level. So while I'm not a Black individual myself, it became very apparent that this was a cause a lot of people had really strong emotions towards. The picture on the slide here is one of the protests that I attended. And you can see just how many people were in support of this movement, reflecting that larger sense of burnout at a societal level. And some of us have also had the privilege of experiencing natural disasters in addition to a pandemic over the last year. So on Labor Day weekend, Salt Lake had gale force winds coming through, where if we were on the coast, they would have been classified as a Class 3 hurricane. And it came through and ripped down a lot of trees, took out a bunch of infrastructure. My own home was out of power for about 4 days. And you can just see this massive tree from one of our parks that was destroyed. And then there's the kid there for scale. So these are just a few of the things that help contribute towards my overall stress and some of my feelings of burnout over the last year. And I just want us to share this, not to try to win the pity Olympics, because I don't think that's a competition that anyone necessarily wants to win, but to just take a moment to acknowledge that we've all experienced burnout over the last year from a number of different sources. So if you want to just take a moment in the chat to type in one of your experiences of burnout and how it might relate to some of these contributors. For example, did it have to be with an increase in workload that came from switching from being to working remotely? Did the fact that you had to work remotely, that loss of control, did that also complicate things and lead to extra sources of stress? Were there any rewards that ought to be given to you that were not given to you as a result of all the economic turmoil? A lot of people lost their jobs somewhat unfairly. One thing that's being present in my life is also the loss of community. When you're not meeting in person, it was a lot harder to kind of manage a lot of those small world networks. And, this slowly contributed towards a sense of burnout as well. Thinking about the Black Lives Matter protests, it was very clear that a lot of people felt that there was a lot of unfairness in society. So while that's not one that I personally experienced, that is one that seems like it was fairly widespread. And as well, just thinking about whether or not there are any like conflicting values. All right, so let's see what people are talking about here in the chat. So we got loss of regular employment, loss of sports participation. So those are all, both good examples of sports participation. One way we can help manage our burnout. The loss of employment is something that probably created quite a bit of stress. Fire evacuation, someone else had a natural disaster in their area, it sounds like. Being overworked and underappreciated. Loss of contacts from people within your community, the social isolation. Yeah, so just as we're all kind of going through and thinking about this, it's really important to consider how these experiences that lead towards burnout could potentially be linked to these six different contributors. And the reason why I think it's important to recognize that is while there's a personal component that can lead towards burnout, there's also a broader organizational and systemic component to burnout as well that's often not recognized. So while there is often an onus on the individual to try to tackle burnout, it's also important to think about how we can potentially reorganize organizations in order to mitigate the impact of burnout for individuals working within those organizations. So to go into a little bit more detail about what burnout exactly is, experts have largely agreed that there's three main components to burnout. There's the sense of exhaustion. There's the feeling that you're inefficacious, that you're not able to live up to your full potential, as well as kind of a resounding cynicism or lack of trust that we might often have. So all these three things combined together are what scientists refer to as burnout. Um, and what I'm going to go through today is some of the biology and how these things kind of link together and what the impacts for you personally might be, as well as some ways that we can try to remediate those. So, being a neuroscientist, my mind always drifts towards the biology. So, I want to start by talking about stress. Um, and stress is something that is not simply burnout, but it's a really convenient way for us as neuroscientists to start to understand what might be happening with burnout to try to understand biologically what's happening. So, based on the experiences that we all shared in the chat, I feel like we can all kind of relate with this cartoon. The world's kind of on fire, but we're okay. We're getting through it. So the next thing to think about then is what actually happens when we're perceiving all these stressors around us. Well, it turns out we have a biological system called the stress response system, specifically designed to try to help us channel these feelings of stress into something that could be a little bit more productive or advantageous. So I'm just going to take a brief moment to walk through this diagram on the right-hand side. I know it might seem a little complicated, but there's only a couple important things that I really want you to take away from it. The first of which is that stress is often psychological in nature. We have to subjectively evaluate something as being stressful, and this is what turns on our physiological response to stress, which is referred to as the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. But I know not everyone is as fond of really long terms as scientists, so we came up with an acronym, the HPA axis, which is just a little bit more easy to say. So when the HPA axis gets turned on, there's this flood of hormones that originally comes from a region of our brain called the hypothalamus and then the pituitary gland. And then that eventually leads to the activation of our adrenal gland where cortisol is released. And cortisol is one of our primary stress hormones. It's one of the most well-researched hormones as far as stress within the scientific literature. So a lot of our understanding really comes from this. And what cortisol does is it then floods throughout the rest of our body and it changes the way the different metabolic processes happen in different cells. So I'll go into a little bit more detail about that in just a moment. But the important thing to think about for the cortisol is that it's changing the way in which our body is operating. And originally, from an evolutionary context, this was designed to help us deal with the original source of stress, survival. So back in prehistoric times, we would be presented with, challenges to our survival, such as bears. And we would have to, escape from the bear, and that was of critical importance. And cortisol is what changed our metabolism so that we would have the ability to run away from that bear for an extended period of time. So we get, initially get our flight system activated. This will give us, a few minutes of a boost so we can really run away. But then cortisol is what lets us extend those feats of athleticism out even longer towards, tens of minutes, towards even hours in some cases. Um, so I thought that this is nicely encapsulated by this meme. Basically, cortisol is what's letting you break your personal record by giving you the sufficient biochemical motivation. As you probably have not experienced a bear in a little while, it's important to recognize that in our current society that our stressors have actually changed around a little bit. So in our normal circumstances, we would experience stress. We'd have a stressor like the bear presented to us, and our cortisol levels will go up. But importantly, we would escape from the bear or get eaten, hopefully not eaten, and our cortisol levels will go back down to a baseline. And then they will go back up next time a stressor is presented, but then they go back down, and maybe they stay down for a little bit, or maybe a few more stressors happen in quick succession. But the important thing is that there is this return back to baseline. And this is in contrast with chronic stress that we often experience in our current society, where we experience a stressor, our cortisol levels go up, but we don't get the opportunity to fully engage in that recovery process. So instead of our cortisol levels going back down to baseline, instead we get this new baseline. And then the next stressor is presented and our cortisol levels go even up. And over time, we get this effect where we have this new gradually increasing baseline. So we're having all of this cortisol flooding our system, changing our metabolism. And that's not necessarily a good thing. In fact, it can be quite detrimental to our health. So just to give a couple insights into how that can come about, when cortisol is interacting with all the different cells in our body, it can do things that prepare us for those feats of athleticism. But if we're not actually doing that athleticism, it can start causing other problems throughout our body. For example, high blood pressure means that we're getting all the blood and sugar that we need to our muscles in order to escape from the bear. But if you're not actually escaping from the bear, then you just have high blood pressure, which we know is a risk factor for heart disease and other conditions like stroke. If you're not using all the blood sugar that's being put into your bloodstream, then this can lead towards risk factors for diabetes and can lead towards other digestive issues like gastrointestinal problems and leaky gut syndrome. Something that's perhaps more acutely that we're all aware of is the fact that having chronic stress can lead towards a weakened immune system. So this can make us more susceptible for infections from a particular virus that seems to be making its way around the world right now. And then there's also psychological consequences of having all this cortisol in our body as well. For example, we can experience depression and anxiety, often are precipitated by highly stressful events. And this can also lead towards headaches and other neurological problems. So overall, this is not a particularly good thing to have in place long term. We don't want to have cortisol in a chronic sense. We just want to use it for that more acute sense. And this is where it kind of comes back to the components of burnout, where really this exhaustion component is really can be scientifically understood as that chronic stress notion, where when you're is experiencing all this chronic stress, your body's basically running out of steam, it's running out of energy, and you get towards this exhaustion phase. And the cortisol that was initially helpful starts causing all those maladaptive health problems that start to run amok over our overall life. But as I previously said, burnout is more complicated. It's a broader phenomenon than just stress. There's also this inefficacy and the cynicism that goes along with it. So while stress is a really easy way for us to understand the biology of burnout, we also need to make sure that we respect the psychology that goes along with burnout as well. So that's what I'm going to talk about a little bit more over the next couple slides. So to those of you who weren't in the last talk on Your Brain on Focus, I'll just give you a quick refresher for executive functions. Basically, this is a set of high order processes that allows to engage in long-term goal-oriented behavior. It all comes from a particular brain network that's referred to as the frontal parietal integration network. But again, for those of you who don't like long, complicated terminology, I just like to refer to it as the focus network. I think that's a little bit more bite-sized and you can speak a little bit easier. But overall, this brain network allows us to engage in focused attention, allows us to take one particular thing and focus on it, potentially at the expense of all other things. And this is a building block that allows us to engage in much more complicated behaviors. So for example, this network allows us to engage in planning behavior. To all of us who are professionals on the call, which I think is actually the majority of us, we're in large part paid for our ability to plan and follow through with those plans and the rigor for which we're able to come up with these plans. So executive functioning and that focus network is what allows us to create our optimal to-do list for the day and to follow through with that to-do list so we can be effective both in our personal lives as well as our professional lives. So in this study that I want to share with you guys, this was actually a meta-analysis, meaning that they did a study of other studies, which allows us to look at really big trends in the scientific literature that might not be potentially one-off. So we can have a little bit more faith that these results are real and generalizable. So this study was actually able to look at upwards of 1,500 people for this particular set of analysis. And they were looking at what happens on measures of executive functioning when people are under conditions of stress. In this case, they're looking at working memory. So this is your ability to store and manipulate information, your ability to do reasoning, and your ability to engage in that planning behavior for your goals. And they found that if you had a relatively low demands on your working memory, so just kind of, a work as usual, it's kind of stressful, not too bad, that stress actually didn't have that much of an impact on your working memory. It was somewhat negligible. However, if you look on the left part of this graph, where people were under high conditions of they had a much more demands on their attention. They had more information. They had more things they needed to juggle. This is where the effects of stress really started to manifest with our executive functions. And people perform quite a bit worse on these tests. So this would translate into, in a professional setting, that if you're already under a highly stressful circumstances and you're getting asked to do these extra, cognitive demands, that you're going to start to feel like you're not living up to your full potential. This is where that inefficacy feeling comes from, where you know that you can achieve a certain thing, but because of the stress, because of the burnout, you're not able to get to that same peak level of cognitive performance. And this can then limit our ability to actually follow through with things and feel like we're living our best lives. Another component of executive functioning that I didn't get into last time is this idea of task switching. So when you go from doing one task, like following up with some emails, to switching over to your next Zoom meeting, your brain actually has to take a little bit of time to reset and reorganize which network it's going to configure towards that task. And that transition takes a little bit of time. And how much time can depend on a few different factors. This can last as little as 6 seconds to up to as long as several minutes, depending on how similar the tasks that you were doing are to the one that you're switching over to. And sometimes your brain can be a little bit of a douchebag, like in this meme, and it's not going to let you make this transition particularly easily. So that meta-analysis also looked at cognitive flexibility as related to stress. Um, and in this set of analysis, they differentiated out between simply studies that just artificially induce a sense of stress by giving people a cortisol hormone versus genuinely induced stress through other psychological means. The vast majority of those studies used what's called the Trier social stress task, which is basically public speaking. Um, More or less, humans overall find public speaking really terrifying, which is ironic considering I'm currently public speaking at the moment. So that's a really effective way to stress people out. And they found that people that had this more organic form of stress applied to them were had longer transitions when they're switching between tasks. So they're less cognitively flexible. They're less agile. They weren't able to kind of keep up with changing demands as they were going through. Whereas if people just had the hormone applied to them, this actually didn't have much of an impact at all, which again really gets back to the point that I brought earlier, where burnout is not just the biology, but it's also the psychology that goes along with it. So we really need to understand that this is not just a biological process, but it's this overall the compilation of our psychology and our biology kind of playing out at the same time. And probably the best way to summarize this set of studies from the meta-analysis is this old robot phrase, does not compute. Basically, when you're under these conditions of burnout, the information is to come into your brain, but it's not going to be processed nearly as efficiently as if you were not in a burnt out state. And you're going to be left feeling a little bit more drained, that exhaustion piece, and feeling like you're not able to live up to your full potential as far as your cognitive abilities go. And then the final piece of burnout that I'll be talking about today is this idea of cynicism, which I kind of like to think about as whether or not you're willing to trust people. And this can be trust in a few different senses. It can be whether or not you trust the people around you. So, do you have faith that your coworkers are able to follow through the tasks that they've been allotted? Are you able to trust that your family is going to be respectful of the fact that you're now working in the same family environment? Or this could even go up to a broad, more societal level, whether or not you trust just general people in the community to be doing the right thing. And unfortunately, it seems like we're at a bit of all-time low when it comes to this sense of cynicism. So this study was conducted looking at trust in different institutions, large institutions. It was mostly done with an American audience, but I believe there were international respondents as well. And they looked at the large institutions of government organizations, media, businesses as well as NGOs, non-government organizations, nonprofits, or charities. And they basically found that no one has a lot of trust in these organizations over the course of 2020, kind of consistent with a lot of those feelings of burnout that we were reporting earlier. Unfortunately, no single institution was seen as both competent or ethical. They broke trust up along into those two different dimensions. So business was actually seen as the most competent institution, but it wasn't being perceived as particularly ethical. Whereas nonprofits were seen as the most ethical institutions, but they weren't seen as particularly effective. And then poor government, they're there in the bottom left corner where they're not being perceived as particularly competent or particularly ethical. So at this point, we're going to get towards our first breakout room activity. So now I think we have a good understanding of the problem. We understand a little bit more about what burnout is, some of the biology that goes into it, how it's related to the psychology. And I want to use this breakout room activity to really try to link our experiences of these scientific concepts with our own personal experience. So we'll do 5 minutes in the breakout rooms where I just think about how these three components of burnout relate to each other from your own experience. Do you have all three happen at once? Do you only have two of the three? Does one lead to the other? Those sorts of things. And we'll return back after a few minutes to say whether or not there's any additional insight gathered. So Megan, do you want to open up the breakout rooms? So what the last half of this presentation is going to be looking at is ways that we can try to break that cycle. So before I get into the main point, I want to again acknowledge that burnout is often has a lot of systemic factors that come along with it. So that means that while we can all personally, individually do things to try to manage our own burnout, there is still some degree of responsibility for the organizations and the systems in which we operate. So if we're in positions of leadership, it's really worth thinking how we could potentially reorganize things so as to not be incurring burnout on the people that are working with us. Um, that being said, to those who are not in positions of leadership, that might not be something we can really act upon. So the remainder of this talk is going to be about things that we personally can do to try to manage our burnout. But I do want to make sure that people are aware that this is a bi-directional process, that it's not just your personal factors that are going into, but it's the environment that you're operating within. And that, things about the environment can change as well. And or that will be at some point key in order to solving this issue of burnout. But that being said, let's switch over to thinking about things that are within our personal control. So I want to again return back to this idea of stress and how we need to have this component of recovery in it. So under normal evolutionary circumstances, we always have the opportunity to return back to our baseline with stress. Whereas it might have felt like over the course of the last year, we're under this chronic stress condition where our cortisol levels just slowly increasing, going to the moon, not unlike that GameStop stock that was really hot a couple months ago. And we want to find ways we can try to get back to this period of having normal stress as opposed to this chronic stress. And for that, we can actually take some inspiration from the original reason for which we have our stress response system. Going back to the fact that cortisol is a way for us to help us navigate survival situations. Um, Under evolutionary conditions, once you escape from the bear, your cortisol levels do go back down. Remember, it has that negative feed loop capacity. So releasing cortisol actually prevents the further release of cortisol within our body. And this helps us return to that homeostatic level. So we can use that as a way to try to supercharge our own recoveries. And to do that, we can use physical activity. So this is another way to kind of graphically represent that same information from the HPA axis. So basically, when you are living a very sedentary lifestyle, as many of us are often forced to do, working in office environments and sitting for large periods of the day, when we get stressed, we don't really have any outlet for that stress to go through. So as a result, the hormones just kind of simmer around in our body and kind of reverberate, and we can get this deregulation, and that's where the chronic stress comes in. However, if you regularly exercise, you're actually using that stress for its original intended purpose. And once you stop exercising, then those signals that you're stressed, they stop getting sent to your brain, and this actually turns off your HPA axis. So as a result, if you regularly exercise, it's actually going to help your body automatically start to recover much more quickly when you do experience stress. Um, I read a joke a while ago that when most people get stressed, they watch some TV, but when runners get stressed, they go for a run. And doing that, intense physical activity, we wouldn't normally think of something that's de-stressing, but it actually, the physiological level really is. And this diagram just kind of highlights how that process can come about. One other way that we can try to buffer burnout is by leveraging social support. So humans are social creatures. And one of the biological ways that this manifests is with the neuropeptide oxytocin. So oxytocin, surprisingly enough, is actually a stress hormone. So it's released sometimes in conjunction with cortisol. But the key difference being that oxytocin tends to be released when we're stressed, but we have some sort of a personal bond, some sort of social connection with the people that we're with, when we feel like we're socially supported. And that's what it's most known for. And oxytocin has the amazing ability basically to buffer and to change our stress response in different ways. So basically, we can think about this as channeling our stress into going from something that feels overwhelming to making it something that's a challenge, something that we can achieve. And this can have the impact with our executive functions as well. So this goes back to that idea of inefficacy. So oxytocin is released from that red brain structure in the middle, the paraventricular nucleus for all the fellow nerds in the crowd, and then it goes through our bloodstream and it interacts with all a bunch of other brain structures throughout our brain that have a lot of impact for our executive functioning ability, and it can then mitigate the effects that cortisol would have on those brain structures. So when you're stressed, but you know that other people have your back and you have a good social support network, you physiologically feel that stress differently. It stops becoming overwhelming, and instead you can start to see that stress as an opportunity for a challenge, something that can be overcame, as opposed to something that's going to continue to make you more and more cynical. Again, going back to really breaking that loop of how the different components of burnout are related to each other. I wanted to try to find some way that we could give people a nice concrete thing. So I did some polling with our team at Conscious Works to figure out a novel solution I'm really excited to present. So our novel solution for how we can manage burnout is a dance party. So when you think about it, a dance party has a couple different components to it. First of all, you're actually physically moving. So this gives you that exercise component. When you start dancing, you're moving, you're exercising, you're getting your heart rate up. So you're engaging your stress response system. But again, it's for that adaptive purpose. And then if you're like me, after about 3 songs worth of dancing, you no longer have the energy to keep dancing, so you stop. And that's what gets you into that recovery phase, where then now your HP axis is doing its normal shut off procedure. And again, it's helping you train your body to shut off more regularly when you experience other kinds of stress. Additionally, I don't know about you, but I often prefer dancing with other people. So this is where you can get that social connection piece to come in as well. When you're dancing with friends, this can often help you get more of a workout, because suddenly you don't want to be the wet blanket that stops dancing halfway through the song. So you and your friends are going to continue to kind of drive that forward. And then you're laughing, you're having these positive emotions, and it all kind of coalesces together. And then one other thing that I want to mention about this idea is that when we do dancing, we can also do this with a socially distanced approach as well. You can do dancing through Zoom and just share the music source. And this is one way that even if someone does have to go into isolation or into quarantine, where they can still have access to this tool as a way to try to mitigate their burnout. And then perhaps one thing that I think is really important is that dancing is often inherently fun. If you are getting into the dancing, it's hard not to smile. And I think that when we're trying to find ways, when we're already feeling exhausted, we want to use solutions that are somewhat fun and desirable for us to go through. Um, I think that, if you want to go for a run as a way to deal with your stress and mitigate your burnout, that's your prerogative. But for me, sometimes when I'm feeling really burnt out, the last thing I want to do is expend a lot of energy for something that cognitively I know is good for me, but emotionally I just really don't want to do. But something like dancing that is inherently fun, I'll be much more motivated to try to do when I am in those moments of not being able to bring myself towards it. And then I'll have this playing in the background. There's often a cultural component that can come with dancing as well. So look how happy this guy is. He just got his COVID vaccination and he's dancing. Also, imagine doing this for more than a few minutes. Think about how much of a burden you're going to feel in your legs. So this is a good workout as well. So you can also get in touch with different cultural practices as well. So you could do this with your grandparents, you can do this with other people from other cultures and make this a learning opportunity as well. So that's the last major point that I had as far as that goes. But then I also wanted to just do a quick recap before we go into the general discussion. So, as I have been going through over the course of this presentation, there's three major components of burnout. The first of which is exhaustion, which you can kind of think about as unending stress. When you're getting all these things coming at you and your cortisol levels just keep going up, and you don't have the opportunity to engage in that proper recovery. Another component to burnout is inefficacy, where because the impacts of stress hormones upon your brain, you're not at your peak capacity. You're not thinking the most clearly. You're not able to switch tasks more as effectively as you otherwise might be able to. And as a result, you're not going to be the best version of you, either in your personal life or your professional life. And then finally, that this often comes along with a sense of cynicism, this loss of trust in one another. These can all feed into each other and create that cyclical conundrum that we want to escape. Whereas things that we can do personally as ways to try to break this cycle is we can really leverage connection. We can leverage our social support. So we can get that oxytocin also being released at the same time as our cortisol and transform that stress response into something that helps us better tackle challenges. And then finally, there's the idea of recovery, that we're able to more effectively recover from our stressful experiences by engaging in things like physical activity. And then I want to do a quick shout out. So here at Conscious Works, we actually did a podcast where one of the episodes is specifically focused on burnout. So we just put the link to that podcast in the chat. So if you want to learn more about this topic, I highly recommend checking out that podcast as well. And at that point, I'll shift it over to Lisa for some closing remarks.
First of all, thank you, Ty. That was really, really interesting. With the podcast, what we were able to do is interview Dr. Christina Maslach, and she is the founder, the researcher that coined the term burnout, and where Ty really addressed it from that biological, neurological part of burnout. She talks a little bit more about the systematic impact and what we can do as leaders, or what companies and leaders can do for burnout, and it's a really, really interesting podcast. Am I biased? Absolutely, but it's fascinating, that discussion. So we've created at Conscious Work several products to help with burnout, and really taking into account that budgets are tight, and making sure that they are at a low cost. So everything from courses to workshops to what we call Workplace Resilience Roadmap, which is a comprehensive workplace wellness initiative with impact surveys and live events like personal chef and yoga classes and meditation, leadership support, and short impactful action items, all for the cost of pretty much one corporate yoga session per month. So if you want to talk to us about that and more information, Megan's going to put it in the chat. And certainly reach out to Megan to set up a meeting if you'd like to, or just want to get an adult friend during COVID, because we don't know how to do that anymore. And then for research-based information on performance and proactive mental health, please follow Conscious Works on all the different social media platforms. And we do have a resilience webinar coming up in April. So the information is posted in the chat to register for that. And that's going to be the positive spin on all of this. Ty said he's going to break you down and then bring you back up. So we're going to look at it kind of from that negative framing, and then certainly from the positive framing going forward.
For everyone that joined today, thank you so much.
So everybody has to go home and have a dance party. And by go home, I mean the other room. I don't know.
You can follow up with us on LinkedIn or something. What is the song that you did your dance party to?
Yeah, there you go. Well, thank you guys so much. I hope you have a great rest of day. I hope that there's a few things that you can take away, maybe some systematic stuff, but definitely some individual things for burnout. And join us next month for resilience, where we bring you back up. Bye. And the waving to the camera. Yes.
See ya.
See ya.